Hi there, welcome to the webinar Boosting Your Internal Communications Through the Power of Visual Content. My name is James Osborne. I'm an enterprise intranet specialist at Interact. I spend my time at Interact working with organisations who want to improve their internal communications, and hopefully I can share some of that experience with you today. Before we move on, there's a bit of housekeeping. If you'd like to ask a question, we'd love to hear from you. You can use the GoToMeeting panel to ask questions, and we'll aim to answer as many as we can at the end of the webinar. If we don't get time to answer your questions, we'll aim to get back to you individually with more information. So let's have a look at the agenda for the webinar today. We're going to start by looking at the rise of visual content, the trends that exist at the moment. We'll look at why this is important for internal communicators. And then we'll look at some tactics for internal communicators to leverage visual content. And then we'll spend a few minutes looking at storytelling and how we can leverage that to improve our visual content and our employee experience. And then we'll look at some companies that are doing this really well, and we'll give you some examples of what they're doing that's working for them. So before we move on, let's look at what visual content is. Now, visual content can be a number of things, but I think these are probably the main ones that we come across. We can have content like infographics, so presenting information in a visual way. Obviously, photography is a huge part of this. Imagery, video, again, something that's driving a lot of visual content today. But let's not forget some of the smaller things like iconography, illustration, data visualization, so presenting information in a visual way as opposed to pure raw numbers, for example. Live streaming is something we're coming across more and more, seeing a lot more live streaming on intranets today than even last year. Animation, so again, communicating information using animation can be very powerful. And let's not forget typography, so whether that's animated typography or kinetic typography, these are all examples of different types of visual content that we come across in our daily lives. So now we've defined what visual content is, let's talk about the rise of visual content. To understand the rise of visual content, I think we need to look at the context outside of the workplace. So I'm always wary of talking too much about demographics and generations because you can end up with stereotypes and tropes. But I do think there is some clear evidence that different generations are consuming content in different ways. And I think actually the majority of that is down to whether or not people grew up with the internet and with YouTube and social media. And I think that's the dividing line between generations. And I think the stats that we've seen and that we see come up quite often do bear this out. So I think the younger generations are consuming content on mobile devices far more than any other generation. And that's becoming, and I think every year we see these numbers, that trend continues to increase. So the rise of visual content is clearly being driven by the use of social media by everybody in everyday life. But I think it's quite startling when you look at some of the numbers and the statistics behind this. And I was personally pretty shocked when I read that they estimate that 3.8 trillion photographs were taken in all of human history until the middle of 2011. But in 2015 alone, 1 trillion photos were taken. So if you think about that, it's truly mind-blowing. And if you think about just 1 minute of internet time around content, in 1 minute, Instagram users will upload 46,740 photographs in just 1 minute. And in a minute, 136,000 photos were uploaded to Facebook. And every minute, 2,777 hours of content are added to YouTube. And that one kind of blew my mind the most because I don't understand how that amount of content can be uploaded and still be consumed in any kind of feasible time frame. So I think all of those stats are well understood in the business, in the B2C, in the business to consumer market, and they talk about it as UGC or user generated content, and they know, and they've known facts like 84% of consumers say they trust peer recommendations over all other sources of advertising. So it's really strong. It's not just very prevalent, but it's highly effective. So in addition to lots of content being created and consumed, we're also seeing a shift, and certainly last year a big shift towards creating stories. We're going to talk about this in a bit more detail later about storytelling with visual communications, but the fact that we've seen this rise of content being created with stories alongside it rather than just purely images is quite interesting. And actually, if you look at some of the major brands, they're using that exact approach for business to consumer. So they're using images, they're using text, they're building a narrative and typically delivering that mobile. So we're seeing mixed media of video, images and text used to create and tell a story. So let's move on and have a look at why visual content is so important for internal communicators. And I think that there's some interesting science behind this that hopefully will make it a lot more obvious as to why it works and why visual content is so powerful. So if we look at the effect that visual content has on the human brain, we see some really interesting things. So we're going to look through that in a moment. So before we dive in and have a look at some examples of this, I think it's worth taking a step back and maybe trying to understand why the brain processes visual content so well. And I think if you look at the relative timelines, I think it starts to make sense. If you look at the history of the written word, the printed word, we could perhaps look back 5,000 years and it's worked well for us. However, if you then go back and look at our evolutionary history, we've been interpreting the visual world for hundreds of thousands of years as Homo sapiens, and even longer than that through the evolutionary cycle. So it's not really that surprising that the brain is just hardwired, literally hardwired, to recognise, understand and respond to visual content, and why it is so much more powerful perhaps sometimes than even the written word. So let's have a look at some of the benefits that visual content has over other types of content. So we can see here on these stats alone that visual content creates far more views, 94%. Visuals are processed 60,000 times faster than text, and that's an incredible retention and understanding rate. Again, we see stats around things like text, that 80% of text on most pages just doesn't get read. We're very good at speed reading and we're very good at picking out information. Visual content doesn't tend to have the same problem. We also see that tweets with images, for example, so there's real data out there around the social media that tweets with images get 150% more retweets and 18% more clicks and 89% more likely to get favorited. And the retention, as we talked about earlier, the retention is much higher. So we retain 80% of what we see, 20% of what we read, and only 10% of what we hear. And I think finally, as we saw earlier, there's some really good stats around that video is outpacing news feeds and other types of media in all social media. And I think that's another cue that we should be being aware of. Now this is maybe a slightly worrying statistic, but I think again it's starting to make us think about the type of content we're creating and maybe how long it should be. So this was a study done by Microsoft, and they looked at the how long it took for people to lose concentration on average and the effect that the digital lifestyle might be having on that. So they found that when they did the study first using EEGs, that the average attention span was 12 seconds. So that's quite a low figure to start with. So they redid the test this time in 2015, and to everyone's amazement, it dropped from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. And you might remember reading studies that said that a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. So welcome everybody. We're now officially have a shorter attention span than goldfish. So welcome everybody, the water's warm, come on in. So let's take a quick pause here in talking about neuroscience and visual content. We're going to come back to this and spend a bit of time when we're talking about storytelling, and we're going to explore a little bit more about the neuroscience behind the brain chemicals that are released when we are engaged with content, specifically storytelling and story-based content. So let's park the neuroscience for a moment and let's move into some more pragmatic parts of the webinar here. We're going to spend some time now talking about some of the tactics you can use with visual content. So why don't we take a look at some tactics that internal communicators are using to make the most of visual content. So I think firstly, if you're going to be using imagery on your intranet, stock images are often an easy way of doing that. Whilst it's always better to find original images from within the business, sometimes that just isn't possible. So if you are going to use stock images, I really do suggest you find some sources of some really interesting photographs. One that I come across quite often when I talk to internal communicators is unsplash.com. I've used some of the images from there in this webinar, in fact. It's royalty free, and it's really a big community of photographers creating images and giving them to communicators for free. So I highly recommend you have a look at that to give you some interesting and unique images. Video is something that we've talked about quite a lot already, and if you're not already a convert, this is a bit of interesting research done by Forrester. It's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's kind of coming up with the value of video in words. So the research came to the conclusion that 1 minute of video is worth 1.8 million words, which is a lot of writing and a lot of editing. It's also worth remembering that, particularly in the corporate environment, the vast majority of your audience will be going to your intranet site without any audio. So annotations and subtitles are a great way of using video without sound. It allows people to engage with it without having to hear what's going on. And I think it's worth thinking about annotations, subtitles right at the beginning of the production. So you can see in this example on Business Insider that they've placed the subject to the right-hand side of the frame to give them room to fit high quality and large annotations and subtitles. It works really well. So another thing to consider is the aspect ratio or shape of the video that you're creating. A lot of the people that are consuming this content will be doing so on a mobile device. And I must admit, from a personal perspective, I come from a background, I did film studies at college. I've always struggled with the vertical video, so people filming with the camera upright in portrait mode. And I've always been a firm believer that you should be turning it on its side and filming in the correct cinematic aspect ratio. I've kind of come to realise that is a dying viewpoint now, and it's supported by a couple of obvious points, really. That the majority of people accessing this video content, or more and more I should say, are accessing it on a smartphone, where 90% of view time on a smartphone is vertical. So the screen orientation lends itself actually to vertical video. So I think we need to embrace that. I think we need to be aware of it, at least when creating video content, that perhaps it's going to be consumed on a device in portrait mode. So embrace it, don't be like me and be a stick in the mud. Look at the way in which people are consuming your video, and you might want to change the way you're actually creating it in the first instance. Another trend that we're seeing more and more of is live streaming. So live streaming is a great way of engaging with your audience in an authentic and real-time way. We're seeing it at big multinationals, and we're also seeing it at very small companies. The technology required is virtually free. We will all have a smartphone. You can set up an account with YouTube, Vimeo. You may even have Microsoft Stream, which is part of the Office 365 suite. And these will all allow you to do live streaming. Again, if you look at and take a lead from the business to consumer world, brands are already well aware that 80% of consumers tell them that they'd rather watch a live video than read a blog. And this is a quick question that I sort of sometimes ask organisations when I talk to them. How many content creators does your company have? And often I get kind of a short pause, and I get told we've got 3 in our editing team, or we've got a couple of people that are champions that create content. And I think sometimes it's worth pushing back on that initial response and saying, actually, you should be considering that everybody in your organisation could be a content creator. And in fact, as we've seen with some of the stats, they probably already are creating content. They're uploading images to Pinterest, they're uploading photographs to Instagram, they're uploading videos to YouTube. So they probably are already creating content in one shape or another. So you need to think about ways to embrace and promote the ability for your staff to also create content, and you'll find they'll probably gravitate towards visual content, because that's really far more easy to create often than writing a blog or writing an article. Another really powerful trend that we're seeing, and have been seeing since really 2017, is the idea of ephemeral content. And this is content that really only exists for 24 hours. Snapchat actually started this quite early on, but it's now been overtaken by the likes of Instagram and Facebook stories. And this is really where content and users post content and photos and videos that just disappear after 24 hours. And again, this is really good for point-in-time communications, things that are really relevant to now that maybe won't be particularly relevant in a week's time. And if you just look at the raw stats, Facebook, who own Instagram, said that they've got over 200 million people using the stories feature, which is more than the amount of people that log into Snapchat daily. So it's a growing trend. I think we'll see far more of it in the social media world. And I think you should be looking to embrace that on your intranet and take advantage of this point-in-time, quick, bite-sized type of visual content. Boom Social's CEO Kim Gast has been quoted as talking about visuals and visual content as expressing ideas in a snackable manner. And we've seen that analogy work in other ways as well. So often it can be quite helpful to think about your content through the lens, if you like, of food. So if you think about breaking your content into 3 different types, you've got the bites, which are quick and point in time. These might be GIFs, there might be facts and insights, there may be updates from events, it may be product or service updates. And this is again going back to the Instagram stories. This is ephemeral content that probably won't suffice or last you very long. So typically you're seeing videos of 7 seconds or less in this first category. Then we see content that is maybe more like a snack. So these are 30-second videos, which would equate something similar to a 300-word article or a blog post. And again, visually, infographics fit in this category quite nicely. There's enough there to keep you going, but it's not a full, in this instance, not a full meal. If we look at the final category here of a full meal, this is more like a webinar, like this kind of content that we're doing here now. It might be something like a 2-minute video or a live stream video. And again, that would equate to something like a long form article or blog. Using tools like storytelling along with visuals has proven to be a very successful strategy. And it helps to engage employees both intellectually and emotionally. And when used, these tools do more than just tell. They show individuals situations in which they're able to relate and convey to their own working lives. And in fact, research has shown that stories are remembered up to 22 times more than just facts. And the visuals alongside that help 73% of employees understand their company's strategy. And so if your internal comm strategy isn't delivering, maybe take the time to explore some storytelling practices for better connecting employees on an emotional level. So let's have a look at some of those strategies now. So I think if we want to understand what makes a good story and how to use the art of storytelling, we should probably look to professional writers and authors and really come to understand how they approach writing a story. So as you can see on this infographic, there are a number of stages and things to consider which all go into making a good story. Let's step through them and look at them each in detail. So the first one is having a level of trust and empathy in the teller of the story. So again, that from a corporate intranet perspective might be making sure that you have champions, people that are actually experiencing or involved in the story, whether it's customers or people within your organization, that are delivering this message rather than actors or people that are not actually living and breathing the story they're telling. Now, drama is a key part of any story, and we have to be careful in the corporate world and within organisations that we don't filter out the drama, that we don't whitewash it and try and make it too neutral. Because without drama, a story just doesn't engage, it doesn't get buy-in emotionally. And that also moves into the relatability element. We all experience drama in our lives. We have ups and downs. And if a story is too clean without that level of drama, the relatability drops. We don't believe it. It doesn't feel real. It feels like a corporate video rather than a story. And that, again, moves us into immersion. We're drawn into stories that we can relate to. If we can relate to it, we become interested. We become immersed in the story. And again, that, as the infographic shows, the immersion is where our opinions are likely to be changed, and we're more likely to come on board with you and trust in what you're telling us. And I think simple stories, again, are very compelling. If you've got lots of detail that isn't moving the story forward, that isn't making it compelling, then get rid of it. Simple stories are the ones that we remember the most, whether it's a fairy tale or a children's story. They're far more likely to be remembered. If we look at agency and we look at persuasion, having an ability for people to maybe not necessarily give them the answer not necessarily to tell them the outcome of the story, to rather not lead them to a conclusion, but give them an agency in the story as the listener or the viewer, having that ability and the opportunity for me to come to my own conclusions rather than having a spoon-fed answer becomes far more persuasive, because I'm making that decision based on what you're showing and telling me. And I think the familiarity part, which is the last one here, again, is something we're all very used to. If the story's familiar, and I think this is easier in an organisation where we're perhaps all moving in the same direction, we're working for the same goals, that familiarity is maybe slightly easier. We're not starting from a complete blank slate. We know who the audience are likely to be. So I think that familiarity will help generate the trust and establish that bond, which goes right back to the start of that circle, which is to build the trust in the storyteller and in the narrative itself. So I think it's quite easy to contrast the storytelling approach with the more traditional, if you like, corporate speak. And again, we see this a lot with organisations that and with communicators that aren't allowed perhaps to broaden out their communication strategy into storytelling. And if you look at the two and contrast the two, stories have the ability to entrance the audience, to captivate. The corporate speak is more likely to turn people off. It's the boring content that we've all seen on intranets. Having a story told to you is conversational. We're used to it. And again, I think if we look at the corporate world, there's far more focus on jargon and information and facts rather than having a conversation. I think we can also describe storytelling as an outward. It's moving information out, whereas the corporate speak is very inward looking. It's something that doesn't relate to your world outside of your job. And again, if you look at the content of a lot of corporate information, it doesn't have a story, it doesn't have a narrative, it doesn't take you from one A to B. There's no journey. And again, a good story will take you from somewhere, and it will leave you at the end of the story feeling differently, which is really the objective of any content. And I think that the contrast really is that stories are anecdotal and they are real, and a lot of what we see in the corporate intranets could really be described as mundane. It's just information, it's delivered, it's dry, and there's no emotional involvement whatsoever. So I think those are the contrasts between storytelling as a method versus traditional corporate speak. I think they both have their place, but storytelling can be really powerful. So I mentioned earlier when we talked about the effects on the brain of content and visual content that we'd come back to this. And I was reminded of a TED Talk by David J.P. Phillips, who is a renowned presenter and storyteller and lecturer. And he talks about the impact on the brain of storytelling, and I can highly recommend his TED Talk. He talks about the angel's cocktail of chemicals that are released, and he also describes how they can be released. And if we look at the different hormones involved, we can also try and dive into what they do and maybe how we can look to influence them with stories. So let's start with dopamine. When dopamine's released, it naturally increases our focus, our motivation, and most importantly for us as communicators, it affects memory and increases memory. The good news is that all storytelling, by its very definition, creates dopamine, because all stories, all good stories at least, will have some level of suspense, and that suspense is what creates that dopamine reaction and generates those positive outcomes of motivation and memory. Oxytocin is often described as the beautiful brain hormone. It tends to lead us to be more generous. It builds a level of trust, and as we saw earlier, bonding with the storyteller and bonding with the story and having a level of trust is huge. So often storytellers will stimulate our brains by building empathy, the human touch. This is the reality of a story. And often that level of bond can be built by honesty and truth, and by not leaving out the reality of a story. So if I admit something that affected me emotionally in a story, or perhaps admit to having a failing as part of my story, and being honest and truthful, I'm far more likely to induce a release of oxytocin in the audience and increase the level of bond than if I were just to straight tell a story with no impact and not describe any impact that story had on me or on my life. So endorphins are kind of the fun ones of the bunch, and they create a calm, relaxed attitude towards the subject matter or the storyteller or the story itself. And these are created when you smile and laugh. So humour, always finding something that will make people smile in a story, even if the story itself isn't always highly positive, is a great way of building endorphins in your audience and keeping them relaxed and feeling calm towards the story. And then the final one is serotonin, and serotonin influences the social behaviour by shifting social preferences in a kind of positive direction. And really ultimately what it does is it enhances the value that people place on the outcomes of others. So again, it's that level of buy-in, it's the care and the empathy that I feel towards the people in the story is directly related to the serotonin that's released. So again, the story should have a message that will make me feel like I care about the outcomes of the people involved, which again will create a virtuous circle of releasing serotonin in the audience's brain. So there's a lot to this, and I don't think you need to understand the full neuroscience, and clearly you don't, to create a good story. But I think having a very simple understanding, hopefully this is a good start for some of you who aren't familiar with this, having a simple understanding of how the brain reacts to stories and to visual content is a great way of at least starting your journey of understanding how to become a better storyteller. So in this final section, we're going to have a look at some of our customers that I think are doing it right and doing visual content in an innovative or really interesting way. So we've got a few. We're going to spend a few minutes going through. Hopefully, that will give you some inspiration, and it'll be, I think, quite interesting to see what some of your peers are doing with visual content. So we're going to start off with Southeast Water, and I love their intranet. They called it Gurgle, which I think is a great name for a water company. And one of the challenges they had is that they were getting really good traction with their intranet and great engagement. But perhaps some of the senior managers, the blogs they were writing were quite long, very text heavy. So they came up with a concept they call the 45-second selfie, which is where when the management team particularly are out and about talking to the organisation, they make a point of grabbing a quick selfie with the team or the group in question, and then spending a few minutes tagging everybody in the picture and explaining what's going on. So in this example, we've got one of the management team going into the training session and meeting with some of the new members of the customer services team. And it's a quick piece of content, it's bite-sized, it's visual. If I don't know who this chap is, I can now see him, I can recognise him next time I do meet him. And importantly, he's tagged everybody in the picture, which again would probably allow the users and other employees to click on those links and find out more about those employees and get to know them as well. So this worked really well for South East Water. It was a quick thing. As you can imagine, it's purely a cell phone, a mobile phone that they used to take the pictures, but it really drove a high amount of engagement, and there was a lot more feedback and comments on this type of content, and a lot more engagement than they were getting maybe with some of their more text heavy blogs. So this is Wellington Airport. This is their intranet, and they found some really innovative use of visual content. They had a new IT system going in called the Common User Terminal Equipment, which merged together lots of different airline data and made the lives of the people within the organisation much easier. But often they had the struggle of explaining what it was, why they needed it. And so instead of writing a long article explaining exactly what it was and everything else, they came up with the idea of doing kind of a comic strip, just to really get across in a very simple, clear way what Qt is, why it's useful, what it does, and what the impact was. So in this example, Fiji Airlines have decided they want to fly out of Wellington, but in their old system, they didn't literally have the desk space to add yet another terminal for another airline. So in this world, Qt, or the Common User Terminal Equipment, was a solution to that. It allowed them to host all of their airlines on one system and allowed them to roll it out and welcome, in this case, Fiji Airlines to Wellington Airport. So a really nice use of visuals, allowed them to communicate something reasonably complex and technical to a wide audience very quickly. Now this one's quite interesting. I don't think I can mention the company name, but they're a global entertainment company, and they thought it would be quite fun to have their staff engaging in lip sync battles across office locations and across the world. If you're not familiar with this, think air guitar meets karaoke. So these are people lip syncing and pretending to sing on video over famous songs, and in fact it's been made quite popular by, I think it's Jimmy Fallon on late night American TV, where he gets celebrities on to battle each other and sing famous songs. Quite a lot of fun. A lot of people get involved. It sounds great because unlike karaoke, you're hearing the original song, not the person singing it. Anyone can get involved, from senior managers to frontline staff. It's quite quick, it's great content, it's quite viral, and it doesn't have to last long. It can be a couple of minutes, but great fun, and they've found a massive engagement from that. And also in some of the harder to reach offices around the world, everyone can join in regardless of language. They can all lip sync, and some of the results are pretty funny. So again, another off the wall idea, but one that's really paid dividends for these guys. On a more serious note, War Child are a aid agency charity focusing on working with children in conflict zones. What they decided to do, because they have lots of people within their organisation who are incredibly aware and well versed in the area that they deal with, which is children in conflict areas. So they decided to use some of the TED Talk approaches and put together some information by some of their thought leaders in a TED Talk. And again, the production values were relatively straightforward, but the content was great. It was engaging. It was by people who are passionate about the subject and who could talk authoritatively about their experiences when they're travelling to these regions and working with the communities there. And again, was really highly engaging. And if we think back to the storytelling element of this webinar, they made great use of that in their TED Talks, because they're able to communicate people who are actually out there in the field delivering services and helping communities. They're able to talk about it and explain what the difference they were making. So again, that was a huge win for War Child, and as a relatively small charity, it was something they could do quite easily, again with low production values and without spending lots of money. So one of the final examples here is a small British management consultancy called Oxford Innovation, and theirs was a really quick win actually, which was to be aware that lots of their employees were accessing the intranet either at customer sites or in the office without any kind of speakers or headphones. So they made the quite simple realization that the way to communicate with these audience members was to use annotated video. The video gets across very quickly, in this case, how to use one of the systems on the intranet, Gets it across very quickly in an engaging way, but you don't need the sound on. It's got the subtitles and annotations. And they also had the added bonus that these are screen reader compatible. So for people maybe that are also hard of hearing or struggle with some audio on video, they were able to have that read to them, read out to them. And again, the visually impaired as well within the organisation got value from that as well. So I think, that's just a quick example. It didn't take them a lot of time. They just had to create a subtitle file that went along with the video. And it worked really well for communicating content both visually and in the written word. And I think a final takeaway, particularly if you're doing video and particularly if you do want to use audio with that video, is maybe take a leaf out of Staffordshire Housing and ASOS, to name just two customers who've done this really well. Is if you're going to be doing video, particularly if it's a launch or a big event, you might want to consider giving your staff headphones. So in this case, both ASOS and Staffordshire Housing Group gave branded headphones. And again, I believe based on what they told us that these were relatively cheap. I think in pennies per employee because of the number they could acquire. And it really just makes it's a nice touch. It's a freebie. It's something people can keep. But it also allows them to listen to content without everybody in the room hearing multiple versions at the same time. It's also great if I'm on a mobile device and I'm out and about. I don't have to have the video running. I can plug in these headphones and listen to the content. So it's a quick win. It's a positive experience for the employee because they're getting something. But it also allows you to use video and audio on video where it's required. To its fullest extent. So bear that in mind. It's another quick tactic that's worked for these two companies amongst many of our customers. So thanks for staying with us on this webinar. I think we could have done a webinar on every single one of these subjects we covered. But hopefully you've got a bit more background on the rise of visual content and understood why it's important, particularly for internal communicators. Hopefully some of the tactics we discussed were useful and interesting, and I really hoped you got something from the storytelling element of the webinar today, and also drew some inspiration from seeing what some other companies are doing when it comes to visual content. Thanks again for joining us. We've got some questions which we'll be feeding back to the people individually, and we would really appreciate your feedback. We offer these for free, but we always like to hear feedback of whether we've covered too much, not enough, whether the subject matter was right, if there's anything we could improve in how we deliver it. All feedback is gratefully appreciated and taken in the best possible way. So thank you for joining us. Have a great day, and hope to see you on another webinar soon.